You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, David.
Hello, Will.
And hello, listeners. Welcome to episode 218 of the Common Descent Podcast. This episode, we're talking about lungs.
That was it. Just a gasp.
Gasps all around. This is going to be a fun one. I'm always excited when we get to do an anatomy topic. We're going to get to talk about what lungs are, the jobs it does for us, how it differs across, how they differ across different groups of animals, and then, of course, the evolution and what little fossil record we have of them.
There's some.
This is an awesome topic, and as always, it was requested. That's why we're talking about it. This was requested by Serpentine, Layla, George, Jackie, Kyla, Science Skink, Richard, Z, and Dustin.
Thank you, everybody. This will be a lot of fun.
Yes. Before we jump into it or our news section, some quick announcements. First and foremost, we have a Patreon. Our podcast is funded top to bottom by the lovely donations from our patrons. And if you sign up on Patreon, you can get extra goodies, extra content, live streams with us, bonus noise and bonus news. And at certain levels, you can get your name shouted out. And this episode, we would like to welcome Nick as one of our newest patrons.
Welcome. Thank you for your support to all of our patrons who allow us to do all the cool stuff that we do here.
Yeah, if you would like to join in on supporting us that way, you can find the link down in the description and get extra goodies yourself. You can also find links down there for other ways to interact and engage with our podcast and support us. One of those ways is we have a physical mailing address, and sometimes people send us lovely mail, and we got so much lovely mail recently. We got a Bobcat postcard from Anthony with some lovely messages inside. We got a copy of Julie's research, which is full of beetle illustrations that were evidently done while listening to this podcast, which is just so cool.
Fantastic.
And Mary sent us a box of educational material, these skulls that show the evolution of the bones in the skull, and some cool little figurines from the La Brea tar pit and little dinosaur figurines. And it's an incredibly lovely letter as well.
As always, we appreciate these gifts so much. It's so cool to get a little insight into the people who are listening to us, and also little goodies are fun to have as well. Some of those we'll be able to share with others, so make educational use of some of these things.
Yes, I'm excited for that. On to other news. Recently, our spin-off podcast, Leave It to Us, is officially out. It is officially started.
It is, as of the release of this episode, the first 3 episodes of Leave It to Us are out. Leave It to Us is a plant-themed podcast with longtime friends of the podcast, Dr. Ali Baumgartner and Nora Sperling, who go into all sorts of fun plant-themed topics, especially into human interactions with plants. They talked about pine cones, and they talk about house pets and house plants. And there's some really fun other episodes that are coming up that I'm very excited to release to people. You can find Leave It to Us wherever you find your podcasts. You can also join in the discourse on the Discord, the Common Descent Discord. There is a Leave It to Us section. And Leave It to Us is on Patreon, where you can support that podcast and those hosts and get access to even more bonus content. If you want to hear me, I'm in the bonus content over on the Leave It to Us Patreon. So check that out.
So if 7 episodes is too many to wait for the next 5 Ali episode,
yes,
you can go listen to that podcast to get your plant fix.
Leave It to Us is also releasing fortnightly, and on the off weeks of Common Descent, I think is how it has ended up working out. So you can get podcasts all the time.
Non-stop. And speaking of exciting podcast stuff, next month is June, which means we are back around to Croc Month, the recently voted best themed month of the year.
Croc Month, which is pretty good. Croc Month, we'll have some themed episode content. The Patreon Croc and Snake tier will be back, where you can support the podcast and also contribute to charitable donations to places that we will be announcing soon. And at the end of the summer, we'll do a Croc and Snake live stream like we did last year because it was just so much fun.
Yeah, so keep your ears out and get ready for some themed episodes and just so much content of our favorite animals.
Also, speaking of Crocs, Bricks with Basque continues to be a whole lot of fun, which is our recent video series where Will builds Lego sets based on podcast topics.
And I promise that the one for this month isn't a marine reptile.
It's a real shame for all those marine we got to save some for later in the thing. I bet next month's will probably be Croc themed.
You know, it's like, I promise I have more interests than just marine reptiles. And with that, we can wrap up our announcements and move on to our first section, the news. Every episode, we like to gather some recent news and research from the world of paleontology, biology, and evolutionary science to share with you all so we can all stay up to date. What's your news today, David?
My first bit of news is themed to this episode. Our topic is lungs. This news is about animals that don't have lungs, but how they interact with the atmosphere, which is sort of related. Specifically, this is research about what has driven trilobite body size evolution over time. Spoilers, it has to do with the atmosphere. This is research published in Science Advances by Jixin Sun et al., and we will link in the blog post to a press release on phys.org from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Trilobites, episode 82, very famous group of fossil invertebrates, little ocean bugs that were all over the place during the early Paleozoic. Trilobites tended to be small, like most invertebrates are, but they had a huge range in their body size. The smallest trilobites were just a couple of millimeters long. The biggest trilobites were more than half a meter in length. They ranged quite a bit. Because there's such an extensive fossil record of trilobites, a lot of scientists have used them to look for potential evidence of evolutionary trends over time. This study is particularly looking for trends in body size. We talked about this back in episode 144 when we talked about evolutionary gigantism. Will explained Cope's rule, which is a rule that is followed by some groups in the fossil record, where they simply just get bigger over time. As time goes on, the average size of a group increases. We've also talked about Bergmann's rule, which some animals follow, where they get larger bodies at higher latitudes. So there are a bunch of different potential trends in body size. This study wanted to see if they could detect a trend in the body size evolution of trilobites.
Cool.
To do so, they compiled the body size information for lots of trilobites. I mentioned because trilobites have a great fossil record, this is a good test subject for this kind of study. Case in point, these researchers took body size measurements for 4,732 trilobite specimens, representing almost 2,500 species from over 1,000 genera from the Cambrian and the Ordovician.
That would be a lot for a modern group study.
Yeah, it would.
So that's insane. Wow, trilobites.
It provides lots of detailed information. And this is covering about 100 million years of time, Cambrian into the Ordovician. They found, obviously, lots of variation in their sizes. They also found lots of fluctuation throughout time and no consistent direction. They were not persistently getting larger or smaller over time. They also weren't staying the same. That means, for example, that they are not following Cope's rule of getting larger over time. To see if they could find a driver for these changing body sizes, they also compared with temperature records of global climate over time and found no consistent correlation. So body size doesn't seem to have been related to temperature, but it did line up with oxygen levels from these time periods. Research into marine oxygen levels, which is looking at biochemistry of organisms and minerals to get a sense of how much free oxygen was available in the water. That also fluctuated over time. during the Cambrian to the Ordovician, there are 3 major anoxic events, which are times where there was widespread low oxygen in ocean waters. Some of those are associated with extinction events. They found with their data set that each of the major anoxic events correlates with a drop in average trilobite body size.
Interesting.
This also seems to appear around the world. So that it doesn't look like it's just restricted to 1 or 2 locations. They noticed this in their global sample. On the other hand, during the early part of the Ordovician period, there was a long period of stable, relatively high body sizes, which coincides with a long period of higher oxygen levels. So it seems that obviously it wouldn't be the only factor involved in how big trilobites got, but the amount of oxygen in the water seems to have been a major decider for how big or small trilobites tended to get.
Cool. Which is not a outlandish idea. That's been the go-to, explanation, or at least that are in a lot of like people's first fossil books of why arthropods, insects and other, buggy things were so much bigger in the past is oxygen levels were higher. So it does make more oxygen means you can fuel bigger bodies.
Right. It also means that trilobites reacted to certain conditions differently than we see at other times. So in the paper, they specifically discuss the end of the Ordovician was an ice age. And in our recent ice age, there is a very consistent trend of the ice age being associated with larger body sizes in a lot of vertebrates and invertebrates. The logic often being that when you're larger, you retain heat better, so it can help to persist in cooler temperatures. But during the Ordovician ice age, at least for trilobites, it seems that the oxygen levels were more of a factor than temperature.
Yeah.
And so they showed the opposite trend, as when oxygen levels dropped, their body sizes dropped. So this study potentially will form a foundation for now comparing to other organisms and seeing, do we see the same sort of trends in other groups of animals? Is it different at different time periods? Did other invertebrates show this same fluctuation with oxygen levels? There's a lot more to be investigated now that we have the basis with trilobites.
Very cool. And it makes the first question that came into my brain of talking about size trends in trilobites. I wonder if they followed deep sea gigantism. Were abyssal trilobites massive?
And that I don't know. I don't know how many deep sea trilobites there were.
Yeah, exactly. Like we're not going to have a lot of those fossils because deep sea habitats tend not to fossilize well. So I don't know whether we can answer that question with our current collection, but it immediately brought that. Or do we have like the deep sea isopods of today versions of trilobites that are just way chunkier than your average trilobite?
Could be.
Cool. Oh, that's fun. Well, my news also has to do with temperatures in a way, but it is focusing on a polar habitat, and it is looking at the plant assemblage in Cretaceous polar habitats from Australia and how that changed during the early Cretaceous. This research is by Vera Korasidis and Barbara Wagstaff in Alcoringa, an Australian journal of paleontology, and the article is by Vera Korasidis in The Conversation. So, in the early Cretaceous, and specifically between about 130 and 100 million years ago, Australia was much more polar. It was much closer to the South Pole than it is today. It was up to 80 degrees south of the equator. But this was also one of the warmest times in Earth's history, so there were no polar ice caps. Sea levels were quite high, and this means that Australia would not have been frozen over even though it was so far south. But it still would have experienced those interesting polar winters where the light dips down. And we've talked about this before, that means there were polar forests that were experiencing light regimes that we don't see forests experiencing today. So it's always been a very interesting question as to what were those forests like. This study is a palynology study looking at the pollen in rocks from different sites across Australia, 48 different sites, and getting an idea of what the plants were like that made up the polar forests of Australia during this time, and how did they shift throughout that time period. How did the members of the forest shift? The main components of the open canopy forest that would have been here would have been conifers, but the group of conifers shifted from one group to the other as time went on through this period. And then they also saw a changeover in the understory plants that once again started with ferns of one particular group and then moved to ferns of a couple other groups. But they also noted the presence in the later deposits of flowering plants starting to infiltrate the understory and even replace previous plants that had been there. The plants they found also imply a high rainfall habitat. So this was kind of rainforest-y, at least a lush, rain-heavy forest. Based off their observations and the warm conditions of the time, they think those warm temperatures were likely a big driver in the plant turnovers and groups that went extinct, of increasingly warm temperatures being good for some groups and not as good for others. They also think that's likely why we see flowering plants come in as temperatures get warmer, that it was a benefit for them coming in, but potentially not for the plants that they took over. Many of the understory plants that had been present in the earlier deposits, some ferns and lycophytes, which are like club mosses and stuff, seem to have gotten out-competed and replaced by flowering plants. They also think that this increased competition could have been a result of the fact that this was in a floodplain and the areas would have been flooded and then recolonized by plants after floodings, and that it seems like the flowering plants might have been better at that they might have been better at coming back in after the floods and getting a foothold before the previous residents could. And so this is just a fairly detailed look at what the forests in this polar region would have looked at and how they changed over time in Australia.
It's very cool to see that there were a variety of different plants and that they were sort of changing over time, because it suggests that even though the polar region is an unusual place to be a forest and to survive as a plant in general, there was a diversity of plants that were able to do it back during the Cretaceous period, which is very interesting. I wouldn't have been surprised if they had found a very homogeneous assemblage of plants, where it was sort of restricted in which types of plants could survive there. But it sounds like there was a variety of plants, which is very cool to know.
Yeah, they mentioned a few different major groups. And I thought it was interesting that the turnover rates and especially when flowering plants seem to come in and start replacing certain species or outcompeting certain species, was only in certain levels of the forest. The understory, we were seeing a lot of that. It was still an open conifer canopy throughout this whole time. The angiosperms hadn't come in to replace any of the trees, but they were fighting for ferns and liverworts and things like that and taking over the understory.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting dynamics.
Yeah.
Well, my next bit of news is about fossil footprints, specifically footprints that are older than we would have expected these footprints to be. This is research by John Long et al. In Nature, and we'll link in the blog post to an article on Live Science by Jess Thompson. The footprints in question are some of the earliest footprints that we know of. So we've talked a bunch before on the podcast about how tetrapods, the land-dwelling vertebrates that evolved from fishy ancestors, got started in the late Paleozoic. The tetrapodomorph fish, so the fish most closely related to true tetrapods, show up in the late Devonian period. The oldest fossils of tetrapods, like proper on land, walking around on 4 feet, tetrapod, amphibian-like creatures, go back to around 350 to 345 million years ago in the early Carboniferous period. The oldest amniotes, which are our reptile and mammal ancestors, animals that laid better land-adapted eggs, amniotic eggs, The oldest amniote fossils are from later in the Carboniferous, around 320 million years ago. These include skeletal remains of a small reptile-like animal called Hylonomus, as well as trackways that are identified as Notalacerta, which have both been interpreted as probably early reptiles, making them the oldest known fossil evidence of reptiles and the entire amniote group. With all of this evidence, it seems that tetrapods and then amniotes diversified across land after the Devonian ended and during the Carboniferous period. This study changes things. These authors report on a new record of amniote tracks that are significantly older than the previous records. These come from the Snowy Plains Formation in Victoria of Australia. This is a deposit of sandstone that includes a bunch of different tracks in it. Not only like footprints individually, but trackways where you can see several steps taken. Both the front and hind feet are preserved as tracks, and they report there are 3 overlapping trackways.
Cool.
It sounds like from their description, there are multiple layers preserved here, and there's one set of footprints, and then some raindrops, and then another set of footprints, and then I think possibly some like desiccation cracks that the sediment dried out, and then another set of footprints that all appear to be the same species, if not the actual same individual animal.
Yeah.
All of these tracks, which again, both hands and feet, have 5 digits and claw marks. There are scratches in the sediment from claws. And the claws are an important piece because claws, as far as we know, are an amniote feature. Amphibians don't have claws, like true claws, like other animals do. Episode 163 for more about claws.
I was wondering about that when you said amniote tracks. I was kind of, how do you know?
Yep.
That's a pretty good tell.
Partly it's the claws, and then also the number of digits.
Yes.
Helps to rule out some of the other early tetrapods. So altogether, the features of these footprints suggest amniotes, probably sauropsids, so the reptile lineage. Overall, the paper notes that they are most similar, if we're looking for a modern comparison, the footprints are most similar to monitor lizards. These weren't monitors. This is way before true monitors ever evolved, but that seems to be the general sort of foot shape. They note that based on the spacing of the hand and foot prints, that the hip to shoulder length of the animal seems to have been around 17 centimeters.
Okay.
So like half a foot from shoulder to hip. The features of the footprints allow them to identify it as not a new ichnospecies, but as Notalacerta, the same footprint genus that the previous oldest known amniote tracks belong to. As I mentioned, the previous record was around 320 million years old. These tracks come from a deposit that has been dated to around 355 million years old, which not only is more than 30 million years older, it's also right at the start of the Carboniferous period, which suggests that true amniotes had evolved by the beginning of the Carboniferous. And since true amniotes evolved from other early tetrapods, that suggests that true tetrapods probably got started in the Devonian.
Yeah.
Earlier than we had suspected.
Huh.
Which means, as the authors point out, that the evolution of tetrapods moving onto land happened earlier and or faster than we thought it did. And it also suggests that the early fossil record of tetrapods is not as good as we thought it was.
Yes.
That there should be more fossils out there that we haven't found yet. Notably, this early Carboniferous time period is also Romer's Gap, which is a time period that is famous for having a lower than expected amount of known land fossils. So it's not actually surprising that we haven't found a lot of these fossils of tetrapods, because this is during a time where we just don't have a lot of good terrestrial fossil deposits.
Very interesting. This is such a tantalizing bit of evidence.
Yeah.
Huh. No, I'm really excited to see if more finds come out from this area, or what other researchers might glean from this potential reworking of things.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, my next news is also about a very early example of a group, but it's cicadas.
Oh, fun.
Yeah. This is research by Hui Zhang et al. In Scientific Reports, and the article is by Andrew Paul in Popular Science. So cicadas, we've talked about them.
Episode 190.
This is a fun group of insects famous for coming out of the ground at unusual time frames and also being extremely loud when they're in their mating season. They're also one of the most species-rich groups of insects, roughly 3,500 species. But the fossil record is surprisingly sparse compared to how species-rich they are. There's only about 44 cicada fossils known from the Cenozoic, so not super common in the fossil record. And among the singing cicadas, one of the groups, the Platyplerini cicadas, are really well known today. They're widely distributed, they're diverse, and they have very distinct features that make them notable and identifiable. They evidently don't have any fossil record until this research.
Ooh, fun.
This seems to be the first Platyplerini cicada fossil.
I assume they identified it because they cracked a rock open and they heard it singing from within the layers.
It had been trapped there, had been waiting to get out.
You've heard of a 17-year cicada. This is a 17 million year cicada.
And then the rest of the messel pit starts vibrating as they all wake up. This is from the messel pit, so this is from Germany.
Okay, so not 17 million years. It's quite a bit older than that.
Yes, this is from the Eocene. This specific specimen dates to about 47 million years old.
Whew.
This is a new genus and species, as you'd expect, being the first fossil member of a group. This is Eoplatyplura messelensis, and is a really nice specimen. They say it's almost completely preserved. You can see detail on the insect, including features and the patterns on the wings. So really nice specimen. It is about an inch long and would have had a wingspan about 2.6, 2.7 inches. They also noted things like it having broad forewings, which are things we talked about in the cicadas episode. Is one of the different groups have different wing proportions, but it also has the patterning on the wings, and they are similar to the ones we see in modern members of its group that live in wooded and scrubland habitats and use them for camouflage. So it's very likely that this was using the patterns for a similar adaptation. This first specimen is female, so we do not have the evidences of the noise making that the males would have, but based on the group it's from, we would expect the male, if we find a male member, to have noisemakers in its abdomen. This is always exciting. We have a first fossil member of a modern group. It's also one of the earliest known fossil cicada from Cicadidae in Eurasia. Cool. So one of the earliest there, and the oldest confirmed for the subfamily Cicadinae that we found yet. So a very exciting first in a number of regards. And the first described fossil of a cicada from a singing cicada group. This one wasn't a singer, but it was from a group that did, of the messel pit.
Very cool.
So just a first in many different ways, which is always fun.
Count on the messel pit to give us a cicada fossil.
Right? They noted this also adds to the biota of the messel pit. We now have another layer to the ecosystem that was there. It also fills in a gap in Eocene cicada fossils. So it is helping to fill in that sparse fossil record, but evidently there was a gap where this one falls. So that's useful for cicada researchers. And they're hoping that it will serve as a future calibration point for molecular studies on cicadas, and that we now have another data point and for a fossil point for a group that we didn't beforehand. So they're not doing any of those studies in this, but they are hopeful that it will be useful for that in future studies.
Yeah. Very cool. It must be so exciting to find a fossil like that, because this is the kind of fossil that I assume you split open a rock or something, and then it's just a cicada.
Yeah.
And you get to be a researcher or an excavator who looks and goes, oh, I found a cicada. Here it is. There's not, I assume that there isn't the same sort of, we found half a tooth and now we have to do a lot of digging and we have to figure it out. You found a fossil and you went, this is a cicada. Let's double check by looking for all the cicada features. But here it is. It's a cicada.
Yes. It looks like a cicada. And it's also fun because I assume either version of the scenario played out of either they popped it open and went, oh my goodness, a cicada, and immediately realized a lot of the significance because they knew there hadn't been any, or it was someone who didn't realize and got to go, hey, I found a cicada. And someone went, are you sure? Because that's a really big deal if it is.
Yes, absolutely. Very cool stuff.
Well, speaking of making noise, while cicadas don't use lungs to make noise, we sure do.
They have a series of tubes.
Yes. They have a abdomen accordion. And so we use chest bagpipes. And that's how we make noise. So let's talk about our bellows and learn about how these lungs work. So as is so often the case when we talk about a body part that we humans have, it is now time to introduce you to a thing you've been using your whole life.
Let's take a closer look at ourselves.
Yep. So lungs, most of us have them.
Deep breath.
Deep breath. These are structures that are fundamental to being humans, being alive, and for many animals, just being animals. It is a very common structure across animal kingdom. The lungs are, for us vertebrates at least, and for mostly tetrapods, is the main method of respiration, of how we take in oxygen from the atmosphere and get rid of CO2 from our bloodstream, that once we've used up that oxygen.
Yes. Many animals only have so many passages that are open to the outside world, and we need to take in materials from the outside world somehow, and the lungs is the chamber where that interaction takes place.
Yep. The stomach is where we take in and process food. This is where we take in and process air.
Yes.
It's also important for us noise-making animals because it's the bellows that produces the vibrations that allows us to make sound. In us and most other of your lung-having animals, there are two lungs, the left and right lung. In us, at least, the right lung is bigger. The left lung shares part of the chest cavity with the heart, so it can't be as big because heart is taking up space.
Sure.
Together, they tend to weigh about 1.3 kilograms or 2.9 pounds. So the lungs are pretty hefty.
Yeah, that's especially for something that's full of air.
Yeah, that's more than I thought. Each lung is enclosed in what's called a pleural sac, which functions to basically reduce friction between the inner and outer walls as they slide against each other while the lungs expand. So it acts as that barrier, that buffer, because your lungs are constantly expanding and contracting inside your body as they fill with air and exhale air. They also have special blood supplies because they are taking in oxygen, poor blood, to oxygenate it and getting their own supply of oxygenated blood because they also have to use up oxygen to do their job and stuff. Each of your lungs are subdivided into lobes, so sections. If you ever see a lung, you'll see that they have these they look like creases on the outside that are these lobe sections, which are further subdivided into segments, and those are further divided into lobules. you will see that lungs are a bunch of kind of fractal subdividing, and we'll get into that here shortly. And this is another fun one. There are 3 lobes on the right lung and 2 lobes on the left lung.
Okay.
Yeah, just to give you some lung math.
Asymmetry.
Some crazier lung math is the cells actually doing the work inside your lungs are the alveoli. These are the gas exchanging cells. These are the ones that are actually transmitting the oxygen to the bloodstream, allowing oxygen to diffuse into the bloodstream. You tend to have 300 to 500 million alveoli in your lungs. And there are 2 different kinds of alveoli cells. Type 1s are the ones that do the diffusion, that do the oxygen exchange. 95% of the surface of each alveoli is this type 1 cell. They're flat cells, and they have very thin walls to allow the gas to move through them into the surrounding capillaries. And they cannot divide. Those cannot replicate themselves. Type 2 cells are more structural and cuboidal in shape, and they can divide and they can differentiate into new type 1 cells.
Okay.
This is the final point of our respiratory tract. These alveoli are where the air ends up as it goes through our respiratory tract. In us, we break it up into the upper and lower tract. Upper is everything in the face. It's the nose, nasal cavity, your sinuses, your pharynx, and the upper part of the larynx above the vocal cords. And then the lower part is the rest of the larynx, the trachea, and the portions that then break up into the lungs. To basically follow that path, your trachea, your windpipe, comes down and then splits at a portion called the carina and becomes the left and right primary bronchus. And these lead to your left and right lungs. These then split into the secondary and tertiary bronchi, which go to the lobes of the lungs, and those bronchi then split into smaller and smaller bronchioles, which finally reach the alveoli.
Mm-hmm. So sort of mirroring the capillaries
Yes.
that they're then feeding into.
Exactly. So your windpipe is this path of constantly splitting paths. And it's that exponential thing of if you keep timesing something by 2 every time, it gets bigger each so that you end up with this incredibly dense packaging of small pathways inside the lungs. Estimates for the total surface area inside your lungs and inside all these pathways varies from 50 to 75 square meters, or 540 to 810 square feet of internal surface area inside your lung. And there's roughly about 2,400 kilometers or 1,500 miles of airway in your lungs.
Makes sense.
Incredibly densely packed breathing system as it just increases as much surface area as possible for us to get all the oxygen out of a breath of air that we can. This is what our human lungs are like. This is not what all lungs are like, though. Most mammal lungs are going to look relatively similar. There's going to be differences. Their overall shape, the size, the density might be different. Generally speaking, this is basically what a mammal lung is like.
Yeah, there's variation. The first that comes to mind is size. There's a lot of animals that are famously able to take deep breaths, like deep diving mammals, or horses just have these gigantic lungs, but they function, as far as I know, basically the same way.
Exactly. But that is not true for all animal lungs. There is quite a bit of diversity among the structure of lung across the animal kingdom. Birds have fairly similar lungs, like in their overall design, but they're not the same structures. So they tend to have relatively small lungs, but still very complex on the inside. They have millions of tiny, small parallel passages called parabronchi, and there are these small sacs inside that are called atresia radiates, and these are the sites of gas exchange. So these are kind of their version of alveoli. So similar structures, different technical setup. And they also have extra air sacs in their body that the lungs connect to that we will get into more detail later on, but will get mentioned at least once more before the break. Reptile lungs tend to have much more simplified lungs. They tend to be more just big pockets of air, so not quite the branching passageway. They also don't have the split bronchus. They have a single bronchus that runs down their body, and then that branches out into the two lungs. So they don't have that initial split. They do still have lots of little pockets in the lungs that are similar to our alveoli, but they're much larger and fewer in number. And it gives it kind of more of a spongy texture. So, like if you think of a kitchen sponge. But then some, like some snakes and lizards and tuataras, their lungs are even simpler in structure, are more similar to amphibians, which are basically just big internal balloons.
Mm-hmm.
Like these are not very complex. They don't have those sac-like structures. They have these internal walls that increase surface area, and they compared it more to honeycombing the inside of the lung.
Okay.
But not pocketing and not making these sacs and pathways the same way.
Yeah, sort of like a big balloon where all of the surface in there is where oxygen exchange is taking place.
Exactly.
Without that internal tubing and connectivity.
Yes. This is definitely a less efficient form of lung. It's not as good at gas exchange, but amphibians also have a much lower metabolism typically, so
yes,
it is perfectly functional for what they need to do. They also have alternate means of exchanging gas.
Yes, and I was going to say it's also more similar to other forms of taking in air. In amphibians, they are often diffusing gases through the skin, which is why the skin has to stay moist. It is a gas exchange barrier. It's also more like the way that gills work, where gills are a surface where the surface area is where that gas exchange takes place. So it's kind of taking that same concept, but turning it into a big internal balloon with various structures inside of it.
Absolutely. And they are not the only ones to use this internal balloon structure. There are fish that use their gas bladder in that same way. So fish have their gas bladder, which is a buoyancy mechanism and allows them to keep themselves positioned in the water correctly. And many of them have adapted it to absorb oxygen from it and can gulp air that way. But since we are talking about lungs, there are true lungs in fish.
Yes.
Obviously, lungfish have lungs.
It's right there in the name.
Yep. But they are not the only ones. There's also coelacanths. They have vestigial lungs. They're not functional anymore, but they do have lungs, and they are unpaired and surrounded by a fatty organ. So I don't know if they're serving a secondary purpose now, but they don't seem to be functional as lungs anymore. There are bichirs, which is a group of ray fin fish. It's the only group of ray fin fish that have what we would consider true lungs.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a pair of them. These are unchambered sacs, so still very simplified. And they do have folds on the inside, so similar to the amphibian lungs. But then lungfish lungs are very similar to our lungs.
Right, which makes a lot of sense because lungfish are very closely related to tetrapods.
Absolutely. Their lungs are paired. They are positioned differently. They're positioned more toward the top of the body, while ours are positioned toward the front of our body, which would be the bottom of the body if we were facing like a lungfish faces.
Yes, that's also true where the swim bladder often is positioned higher in the body because for adjusting buoyancy, that's a more efficient place to have it. And I believe that some fish with lungs can also use their lungs to help with buoyancy as well.
Yeah, because if you put your flotation device on your belly, you're going to float upside down.
Yes, exactly.
You need your flotation device toward the top of the body.
We've all been in the pool.
Yep.
What happens when you try to balance on top of a beach ball?
And interestingly, because it's positioned differently, it also has to kind of twist around the esophagus. So the blood supply and air passageways move around the esophagus in an interesting way. So it is The positioning also affects the plumbing notably differently than ours.
Interesting.
So there are different kinds of lungs, but there's also different ways to use the lungs. The lungs function differently because to breathe, you have to somehow take in air and push out air. If you just sit there with your mouth open, not enough air is going to move in and out of the lungs for them to work.
Even if you run really fast.
Yes, as fast as you can. Naruto running all the way won't cut it. So you have to somehow create suction and pressure to move the air. And different groups do this in slightly different ways. In many cases, it's different sets of muscles that do it. So for us humans, we have the diaphragm. This is the thing that gives you hiccups. This is the muscle that's spasming when you have hiccups. It's a big band of muscle underneath the lungs. It's also part of the portion of your torso that separates your upper body from the lower intestines and all the guts down there. This muscle can pull down and pull the bottom of the lungs down. And if you pull on a bag, it will suck in air because nature hates a vacuum. It creates negative pressure and it pulls air into the lungs when it goes down. And then when it comes back up, it pushes the air back out of the lungs.
Yeah, this is the same way that we've talked about a bunch, how suction feeding works in a lot of fish. If they open the mouth really quickly, water flows quickly into that vacuum. You can do an experiment. I don't know that I ever did this in school, but that experiment where you get like an enclosed jar with a balloon in it, and you can pull the bottom up and down, and the balloon inflates and deflates as the pressure change forces air in or out of it.
Yes, and I think we did that experiment specifically for lungs one time to show this is basically what the diaphragm is doing and filling your lungs by doing so.
Yeah, it's a very funny realization. I remember when I first had this realization that we don't actually suck in air. Like that's not really there's no muscle that is grabbing the air and pulling it in. We're expanding our chest cavity, which, because physics works the way it does, forces air to be drawn into the body.
Yeah, we are pulling on our lungs, and that is making air rush into our body.
Yes.
Yep, it's kind of the weird thing when you learn about the fact that cold does not move, heat moves. Like cold air can move around, but heat
you can't
is the thing that
gain
moves.
cold. You can only lose heat.
Exactly. But not all animals have diaphragms. That's mainly a mammal structure. Reptiles, lizards, and snakes mainly, they expand their chest by moving the ribs. By expanding their rib cage. Our rib cage expands when we breathe, but it's not actually the ribs pulling outward. They just allow the lungs to push them so that we can get more breath. With lizards and snakes, their ribs are actually, muscles on the ribs are pulling the sides so that the lungs expand. In turtles, they can't do that because their ribs are a shell. And if the shell expands, that's a dead turtle.
That's problems.
That's
your turtle's gonna get out.
Yeah, it'll escape. Then you'll have a naked turtle running around, and nobody wants that. They use movement of their forelimbs and the pectoral girdle, which is like the collarbone, shoulders, bones, to force air in and out of the lungs. So they're moving the front of their shoulders in and out.
They kind of are moving like an accordion.
Yeah.
Front and back are moving away from each other, which is a weird thing that you have to do when you have turned your ribcage into your house.
Yep. And it arguably gets weirder depending on whether you find it weird to be expanding your body or moving your liver around, because that's how crocodilians do it.
Oh, yeah.
They use what's called a hepatic piston, which is a liver piston. They shift the liver forward and backward in their body to expand and compress the lungs.
Wild.
It's crazy. They also have a bunch else going on. They have muscles on the ribs that help expand the ribs, and a muscle on a jointed bone of the hips that hinges it downward to expand the belly. So this makes sense. They take big old breaths because they are staying down underwater. But these muscles also pull double duty. they can use these to maneuver because they can use their lungs to maneuver themselves around in the water by changing their buoyancy position.
Yeah, they're using their lungs like a swim bladder.
Yes! And they're doing something that even fish don't do, because fish with the swim bladder are increasing and decreasing the amount in it to change their buoyancy for where in the water column they want to float. Alligators and crocodiles can do it to move themselves. So when they are at the surface and their head is just sticking up above the water, typically the lungs are forward. Their buoyancy is right up in the front of the chest. So they're floating top up and have their head just out of the water. But they do that amazing thing where they just bloop and just disappear below the surface with almost no ripple to the water. And to do that, they can't be kicking their legs or their tail because then they would make turbulence. They do that by shifting their lungs backwards with the liver and moving their buoyancy to the middle of the body, which then makes them float sideways, straight.
It stabilizes them out. It's like you'll see
Yes.
those videos of an alligator in a zoo where the head's above the water and then the body's like splayed out underneath, sort of Godzilla pose.
Yes, exactly.
But if you shift the beach ball, if you shift the air pocket to the center, you level out. So
and
they're
now
not
you're
actually
horizontal.
The body isn't sinking down. The body is going from diagonal to horizontal. That's extremely cool.
Exactly. This is also why they can do that thing where their back can just slowly come up into the water. Because if they just adjust how they allow themselves to move, they can bring the head down or bring the back up. They can also pitch and roll by moving the lungs side to side.
Sure.
So they use their lungs more like how a pilot controls a plane.
Yeah, that's very cool.
It's so cool. Then you get some that don't expand the lungs at all. Amphibians use what's called buccal pumping. They don't expand their chest at all, basically. They're not expanding the lungs to pull air in. They're pushing air into their lungs with their mouth and throat.
Yes, they are doing the thing that I said we don't do, which
Yes.
is physically grabbing the air and forcing it into the body.
So they still have to create some negative pressure to pull air into the mouth, but then they are using the floor of their mouth or their throat to push it into the lungs.
Yeah, they're basically swallowing their air.
Yeah. Like they're not using the same muscles we use to swallow, but they are doing a much more similar mechanism. There are also two different ways to do this, and it has to do with how many steps there are to the breathing process. Two-stroke buccal pumping is amphibian with nose open and throat open, or the glottis, which is the part that seals off your throat and everything, or seals off the airway, lowers the floor of the mouth, which draws air both from the outside through the nostrils into the mouth and from the lungs into the mouth, and then raises the floor of the mouth to push air out the nostrils and into the lungs. And there's basically just sloshing the air from the lung and outside and getting some new air and getting rid of some old air.
Yep.
The mixing is not very high. It's about 20%. So it's not a particularly efficient way. You're not clearing out the old air and getting nothing but new air.
Right. You're getting a lot of your exhaled carbon dioxide back with each breath.
Yes. But it's that thing you'll see frogs doing where their bottom of their mouth is just going, and that's them breathing. This is the most common form of breathing that amphibians use, our modern amphibians. There is four-stroke buccal pumping, which is a more precise but complex form where you have nostrils open but throat closed, lower the mouth to pull new air in, close nostrils, open throat, push mouth up to push it into the lungs, and then to exhale, you reverse the process.
Yeah. So you're exhaling and inhaling separately, so the air isn't mixing as much.
Yes, but it takes 4 steps for one full breath.
Right. So it's slower, or at least more complex, but
Yes.
you're avoiding so much mixing of your new breath and your old breath.
This is not very common among amphibians. There's only a few aquatic amphibians are known to do this, like clawed frogs were mentioned and Amphiuma. But it's also known in some ray finned fish to use this as a way to do that air gulping that they'll do.
Yeah.
There's also a version of this called gular pumping, which is throat. And so same concept, pulling air into the throat and then pushing that air into the lungs. And this is famously known from monitor lizards, specifically the savanna monitors. This has been noted. And it was something that was kind of a mystery about savanna monitors because they're notably running lizards. And usually lizards are not very good at running long distances because they use the same muscles to breathe as they do to flex their body while running.
Yes. So while a lizard is running, their ribs are moving back and forth, their body is contorting, and that interferes with the muscles that they would use to expand and contract the body because those are rib muscles. So lizards often have a hard time breathing and running at the same time.
So they have to kind of run, stop, breathe, and then run some more. Monitor lizards are famous for being very fast and long distance runners in the fact that they can chase prey down. Like they can do an extended chase. And I've seen a video of a monitor taking down a rabbit. So unusually good runners for lizards. And research found that it's because, at least in savanna monitors, they have a gular pump, a throat pump, that is acting as a bellows for them to breathe with while their rib muscles are busy.
Which is a very cool adaptation.
Absolutely. I love that. There is also one other example of not expanding the lung, and that's birds, which seems weird since we talked about that their lungs are actually a lot like ours, but the lung is mostly not expanding and stays the same size during most of the breathing, but their air sacs are the part that is doing the expanding.
Yeah. Bird lungs have all of these offshoots that are these air sacs throughout the body, and the air is moving in and out of the air sacs between the lungs and the air sacs in the next passage.
And they're using the rib cage and the sternum to do a lot of the expansion and movement of the flight muscles, which makes tons of sense.
They're doing the opposite of what lizards are doing.
Yes.
Where they're using the same muscles for two purposes at the same time. So
Exactly.
While you're flying, you're also breathing because they're doing the same thing.
And lizards heard that and went, "Oh, that's such a good idea." Speaking of birds, there's also two different pathways that we often see. We are familiar with what we call tidal breathing or bellows type lungs, where we breathe in and then breathe out through the same way that we breathed in. There's also circular or unidirectional breathing, where the air takes a single pathway. It still comes in and out of the mouth or nose, but inside the body, it is following a single path and never washes back over the same area like it does in our lungs. Birds are famous for this.
Yeah, in birds, because they've got all these air sacs, and basically the way that it works is when we inhale and exhale, we take in a breath, we release a breath. When birds inhale and exhale, they are taking in breath and releasing breath, but they're also shifting the air between the chambers of their respiratory system. Mm-hmm. So they'll breathe in, and all the air kind of shifts to the next chamber. And then they breathe out, and all the air shifts to the next chamber, so that the air is never actually crossing. The old air and the new air are never in the same place at the same time. So it's kind of this conveyor belt system.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's more like an air assembly line than our situation, which is bringing a thing into a shed, finishing it, and then bringing it out of the shed.
Yes, birds have those air sacs surround the lung, and they invade inside and in between the bones of the skeleton, and they serve those extra waiting points for the air to sit.
And so it makes this very efficient both pathway and usage of the air as they breathe. This is also seen in crocodilians, have a unidirectional breathing system, and some monitor lizards have at least somewhat unidirectional, and I think there's some tidal breathing. And I saw it noted that in some of the air sacs in birds, those are functioning tidally, where air moves in and then out of it. But these groups have a different breathing pattern, like pathway, than we do. I also came across something called obligate nasal breathing, that evidently there are some animals that only breathe through the nose. They do not breathe through the mouth.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I just never thought about it. Horses are the famous example.
Oh, interesting.
Horses, and from what I read, I saw this a couple of different places, and I'm sure if you're a horse vet or a person who really knows the details, please let us know. But a lot of things said that horses cannot breathe through the mouth. That if they are breathing through the mouth, it like something's wrong. Like there's an abnormality there. I also saw that rabbits and rodents are considered obligate nasal breathers. That if they breathe through their mouth, it won't really make it fully to the lungs. It's not going to make it all the way there, or at least not well, potentially. So yeah, some animals are only breathing through the nose. Sometimes when we think of this, it's the fact that there's lots of animals that can breathe through the nose while eating. And that's often called nasal breathing and nasal breathing animals. But some animals, it seems, that's the only way they breathe.
Yeah, interesting. This is another one of those fun little realizations to have when you realize how your lungs work, that you can't breathe in through just your mouth or just your nose unless one of them is closed.
Yep.
You have to block the passage because the action that you take to expand your chest automatically draws in air.
Yes. And if there's an opening, air's going to move through it.
Yes. Yeah, if you had, well, that's part of why you can, tracheotomy works.
Yes.
Is you can punch a hole in the throat if a person's breathing pathway is blocked, and that's just a new hole that air can now be drawn in through.
Yeah, your lungs are like, it's not the nose I'm used to, but it'll do.
Yeah, listen, all I'm doing is expanding the body, and air's coming in from somewhere, and that's all that matters.
Your lungs are like, whatever you're doing up there, you're doing great. As we're like,
this is much better than it was a second ago.
Yes. Another group that I did not see listed as obligate nasal breathers, but I assume most of them are, is whales, because they're breathing through their they're breathing through the blowhole, which is the whale nose.
Yep.
That is the nostrils move to the top of the head of whales and dolphins and that whole group. I wanted to mention them because they are also really intense breathers. Like, they hold their breath for very long periods of time. They do not have as big of lungs as you would expect. They have big lungs because they're big animals, but proportionately less volume than most animals. And this is likely to reduce stresses during deep dives.
Yeah, because that's a lot of pressure that's going to be put on that air pouch that you have.
Yes, and air compresses under pressure. So you would be experiencing a very big volume change for really big full lungs to get compressed on a deep dive. So having smaller proportionate lungs might be a survival mechanism for that. They also, though, are really efficient inhale and exhalers.
Yeah, they are.
Like, this is something that you probably, if you've seen whales or learned at all about them, you know, even if you've not thought about it, but when they come up and do the blowhole, and then go back down, that's an entire exhale and inhale in that split second of them surfacing.
They exhale like a sneeze.
Yes.
It's that the blowhole is their exhale. It's that whoosh, all of the air is shot. For a long time, I didn't realize that, because I had it in my head the way that it is in cartoons, that whales are shooting a spout of water out of their blowhole, but they're not. The reason that there's a mist to it is partly condensation, that there's the hot air from the breath, and also mucus, because they're effectively blowing their nose.
Yes. When they exhale and inhale on that single surfacing, they will exchange 90% of the air in their lungs. In literally a couple seconds.
Yeah.
So a whale-sized lung, because even though they're proportionately smaller, a whale's lung is still probably about the size of one of us. Like,
yes, you can curl up inside it.
And they are fully emptying it and then almost fully filling it in a couple seconds. When we inhale and exhale, our renewing of air is about 10 to 15%.
Oh, man.
So Not only are they taking a very fast breath, it is an extremely efficient breath. So this is why they can come up and then go back down and disappear again. They don't have to stay at the surface like we would. Like if you have ever swam and you've held your breath for a while, when you come up, you have to for a while because those breaths are slowly moving out all the old air that has now built up in your lungs and slowly filling it with new air because we are very inefficient inhalers and exhalers.
Yes, because it doesn't really matter for us.
Yeah.
Right, because we're surrounded by air all the time.
Yes. They have to be able to do it all in one go because they might not have to go right back down again and they might not be back for 10 minutes.
Yes.
And then now we get to the section that we often get to with these episodes, as we've just talked about how important and like the crazy specializations that animals have put into this really crucial organ. And now we get to talk about the animals that have reduced and gotten rid of lungs.
Yep.
Lung reduction is actually fairly common. There's a bunch of examples of it. Very famously, as I'm sure has been mentioned a few times on this podcast, snakes and many other long-bodied organisms really only have one functional lung. They have reduced typically the left down to just this little bean or gotten rid of it, and they have a functional and often expanded right lung.
Yeah, most snakes are using a single lung. And like you said, it's the right lung. And this seems to be an extension of the thing that snakes and other long-bodied lizards do, where they move paired organs to be one right after the other.
Yes,
like
yes.
Snakes' kidneys are one and then the other instead of being next to each other like in us. The lungs are one and then the other, but they've stopped using one of them. Or in some cases, mostly stopped using one of them.
You see this in snakes, legless lizards, many caecilians do this. It's also the right lung with them. So your snaky amphibians. Some salamanders have also done this. Amphisbaenians, which are your worm lizards, also do this, but it's the left lung that's the primary instead of the right, just to be different. And the Australian lungfish has only a single functioning lung.
Okay.
Other lungfish have two. It has one that's divided into two distinct lobes, so it seems like it's kind of effectively doing a two-lung job.
They lost one, so they split the one they had left into two to do both jobs.
Well, they got to where they were going, and they went, "Oh no, I didn't pack
lost
the other.
one.
I gotta
Someone's gonna notice. I have to change this." It's like a comb over, but for lungs.
Yes. There are also a number of examples of lunglessness in what we would typically consider lunged groups.
Yeah, like there's a bunch of lungless fish. Like sharks are lungless, but that's their default state. They're not supposed to have lungs.
But that's not a big deal.
No, exactly.
Like, it's weird when a fish has lungs.
Yes.
It's weird when a bunch of land animals don't have lungs. Now, all tetrapod lunglessness is seen in amphibians. There are no examples outside of amphibians, which makes sense. As we mentioned beforehand, they have alternate forms of breathing they can do. Lizard or a mammal cannot decide to just exclusively breathe through their skin. Our skin is not built like that. It is too tough, and it is not nearly slimy enough. So amphibians have that. They're also typically small-bodied. You know, the biggest amphibians are not very big animals, so they can more effectively survive off of that much breathing through the skin. There are at least 4 examples of this occurring in amphibians. One is a lungless caecilian, the genus Atritocona. There are several frogs that have reduced lungs or modified them, and there's one that has been reported to be lungless, though I found research that seems to indicate that they do have some form of lung. This is the Bornean flat-headed frog, which is a very threatened species from Borneo, a very poorly understood species. Dissections did not find lungs, and so they got listed as lungless frog. A micro CT scan in a more recent study showed that they do have a trachea, they do have a glottis, and they do have lungs, though they are very simplified and small compared to body size. So how much function they're doing, they might be functionally lungless, but they are not physically lungless. And then a bunch of salamanders.
Yep.
There's one species of European mountain salamanders known to lack lungs, 12 species of clawed salamanders, and over 500 species in the family Plethodontidae, which are the lungless salamanders.
Yep. We have those here. Those
Yep.
are not like off in some exotic locale. I could walk outside and there's a good chance I could grab one.
Absolutely. And to emphasize that further, not only are they in common areas and things that you probably can find, they are the largest family of salamanders.
Yep.
They make up 2/3 of modern salamanders.
They're doing the snake thing where they
Yes.
got rid of something really, really important and yet somehow have become the best at the thing that they're doing.
Most salamanders, if at a random selection you picked a salamander off of Earth, it probably doesn't have a lung, which is insane. Most are known from the Western Hemisphere, so from British Columbia all the way down to Brazil, but there are some known from the Eastern Hemisphere. At least 2 genera are found over there. Some of these are like cave salamanders that have retained their gills and are aquatic, so they are living off of their juvenile gills, but most don't have gills as adults, and all adults in this group lack lungs. So they are breathing basically entirely through the skin. 83 to 90% of their 93% of their oxygen uptake is just happening through the skin. I assume some is coming through like swallowing and stuff, but also some's happening through the lining of the throat. So they could still do some of that, buccal breathing if they wanted to.
Right. Basically, every part of the body's surface that contacts the air can take in some oxygen.
Yes. They have grooves on the side of their body to increase surface area and maintain moisture so that they can stay damp. And that means that they effectively breathe the exact same way, whether they are in air or in water.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Right? That doesn't matter what medium they're in, they're breathing the same way.
Very cool.
It's so crazy.
Plethodontids also tend to be quite small.
Yes, and very skinny bodied.
Yeah, like you said, that's one of the reasons they can get away with this, is their surface area to volume ratio is quite skewed, so they can take in lots of air for their body size.
Absolutely. I did also find some interesting evidence of their lunged ancestry. In embryos, they do start to develop lungs.
That makes sense.
And then the lungs regress and they go back to being lungless.
Yeah, well, it's like our tails.
Yes.
When we're embryos.
So for a very short period inside the egg, they are lunged salamanders. And then they go back to being lungless.
I say, give this to a lungfish that needs it.
I'm going to hide this in a frog. Those are a big selection of the diversity of true lungs that we find in animals. There are not true lungs, lung-like things that we see in invertebrates.
Yep.
Things doing the same job as a lung, but a very different, much more alien structure than the lungs we were just discussing. Most famously of these are book lungs. These are the breathing structures of spiders and scorpions. These are folds of tissue and air pockets that are full of hemolymph, which is bug blood, basically. And this folding gives it the book-like look and increases the surface area for airflow and air exposure. Now, they do not have the ability to breathe in and out like we do. Very famously, insects and arthropods, for the most part, have to just passively let air pass through and into their body.
Right, kind of the way that fish with their gills. Water moves over the gills and the exchange happens. They can't pull the water in.
Yeah, there's some that can do that mouth pumping to pump water over, but that's why you have those sharks that have to keep swimming to breathe, because that's how they're moving new water over the gills. If they stopped, they would not get enough oxygen. Here, the book lungs are in cavities inside the abdomen that are open to the outside through small openings that just allow oxygen to make its way in.
Yeah, this is what makes them, quote, lungs, is that they are in contact with the air and are able to exchange gases. And they're even still in a sort of chamber enclosed within a
Yes.
wall of the body, because that helps to increase the surface area, but also concentrate where the air is going.
Absolutely. Most other of your land arthropods, insects, and other arachnids like mites and harvestmen and stuff, they use a structure called trachea, which are these, think of them like empty roots. They're these passageways into the body from spiracles, tiny openings on the outside of the body, that are these veins of airways that go into the body and allow air in, and the surface area from all those passageways allows for the air exchange.
Yeah, it's in some ways not dissimilar from the way that our lungs, that our trachea branches into this series of tubes. It kind of is doing a similar thing, where an insect
Yes.
is full of these series of tube passages that just naturally have air flowing through them because air flows into passageways.
Yes, but it'd be like if instead of being in a sac like our lungs are, those tubes just were loose in our body and moving
Yes.
through the body that way.
It makes their breathing system is a lot more like our circulatory system.
Yes, it
Where
is.
like our blood is carried all throughout the body, where their air gets all throughout the body. Our blood carries our air, which is how we kind of have combined the two.
Yes, exactly. With spiders and scorpions, they have these book lungs. They can have between 2 to 4. Most spiders have 2. Scorpions tend to have 4. And these are related and connected to book gills, which you'll often see come up in discussion with book lungs, which are similar kinds of structures. You see them nowadays in horseshoe crabs, which are distant cousins of arachnids. And these are layered and page-like gill structures that can actually flap in the water. The book lungs don't actually flap, so you're not opening and closing them. It sounds like you would, but they just look like a book. They don't function like a book. You also have other terrestrial arthropods, coconut crabs, which are giant hermit crabs. As juveniles live in the ocean, as many crustaceans start out, but as adults can no longer breathe underwater. They have non-functional gills as adults and have lung-ish structures that are called brachiostegal lungs. And these are kind of air gills. They're similar structure and tissue to gills. They're once again folds of tissue that allow for lots of surface area, but they transmit oxygen through air instead of water. And so they are very similar to gills, but made to function in the air. So they're air gills-ish. And then this is one I had never heard of before, pluminate snails and slugs, which are land snails and slugs. They have an air cavity in their mantle, which is a portion that is associated with the shell. And in slugs, it's that little like backpack looking part on their back. They have an air cavity in there, and instead of having gills inside, they have this functional lung that allows them to get oxygen from the air and has an external opening that allows air to come in and out of it.
Yep, very much like our lungs.
Yes. Well, and I love the things with like these invertebrate lungs because they're very similar to our lungs, but it'd be like if we functioned like creatures from Avatar, from Pandora, where you have your face and mouth and then you have your breathing openings in your chest.
Yes.
That bring the oxygen to the lungs, and it has nothing to do with your face. Like their lungs just have a hole that goes to the outside of the body and lets air in.
Well, and invertebrate lungs are so fun to me because they really help bridge the gap between what we think of as water breathing and air breathing, like you were talking about with those salamanders. All of these breathing systems are just a moist surface that is in contact with a medium that has oxygen in it.
Yes.
And functioning in the air and in the water is different, and so they have to be functioning different ways. But like you talked about the crustaceans that have sort of air gills. Where it's like, yeah, it's basically the same thing as a gill, just reorganized and rearranged so that it can operate outside of the water. And in a
Yes.
lot of animals, I think it's really interesting how so many animals have enclosed a chamber where they have. Usually it's like a moist chamber because even our lungs have to be moist in order to work
Yes.
properly. That diffusion happens in the presence of moisture. So like in snails and these other animals, it's like, yeah, I just have a little chamber in here that has a breathing surface on it. It's like the equivalent of a salamander's skin. And I just pull air in and that takes the oxygen out of it.
Yeah.
It's a
Well, and it's
very
just,
versatile tool that animals have.
and it's just like the structure of that tool is like in water, a comb-like, brush-like structure is better to get the oxygen out of the water. In air, you need to trap it, so you need a balloon.
Yes. Yeah.
And effectively, that's basically the difference. It made me think of the fact that we can breathe liquid if we use that like oxygenated liquid that they've used for deep dives, and they used it in the abyss. There's the scene of the rat breathing under the liquid in the hyper-oxygenated liquid, and we can breathe that. It fatigues our lungs because they're not made to push liquid; they're made to push gas. But the oxygen exchange happens regardless.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, lungs. There's a bunch of ways to do lungs, and to even similar lungs, bunch of ways to use them and make them function. They're super, super diverse.
Fascinating. Well, I brought along some information about lungs in the fossil record and the evolutionary history of lungs. So what do you say we get into that after this short break?
Sounds good to me.
Stay tuned. So as you might imagine, lungs are not particularly common in the fossil record.
They are very squishy.
They are extremely squishy. Lungs are basically all air and very thin membranes.
Yes. Like if you've ever gotten to touch a lung, it's so soft. Like
Yeah, that makes sense.
Memory foam soft. It's crazy.
It's like trying to fossilize a balloon. That
Yes.
they are so delicate that the odds of getting any sort of fossil preservation are supremely low. That being said, there are a few examples of fossilized lungs. There are a couple of famous ones. There was a study from 2018 that described lungs in a fossil bird, Archaeorhynchus, from the early Cretaceous of China, known from several specimens, one of which preserves soft tissues, including a pair of similar structures that appear to be the lungs that have been partially soft tissue preserved in this extraordinarily well-preserved specimen. The study that described it points out that the structure of these lungs seem to be similar to modern birds, which not only reinforces the identification that they are probably lungs, but also suggests that bird lung structure evolved fairly early on. There's a similar study that came out the year before of a fossil salamander from the Eocene of France of the genus Phosphotriton, which again is a specimen that preserves lots of soft tissues, including there's enough skin that it preserves like the grooves on the side of the body and the cloaca.
Oh, that's so cool.
Interiorly, there's the digestive system, there's muscles, there's also frog bones in the gut, which is a very cool thing because that's not very common in salamanders. And included in and among these internal soft tissues is a lung-shaped structure that is the right position for a lung, the correct shape, and micro CT scanning reveals the internal structure of it is lung-like. So this appears to be another partially fossilized lung.
Well, and that's a fun example where, like, in most cases, if you found soft tissue preservation and you just found one lung structure, you'd be like, all right, so only one of them fossilized. But with salamanders, that may have been all there was.
Yeah, who knows? Who knows what the salamander's doing? There are a handful of other maybe lungs There's a 2019 study that describes a fossil tadpole from the late Miocene that they surveyed the distribution of trace metals throughout the body and found a concentration of metals that seem to correspond with the structure and position of the lungs. So they might be the remnants of where the lungs were. There's a fossil fish from the Cretaceous called Axelrodichthys, which has also been identified with probably lung tissue. So oftentimes when we do find the potential for lungs, it is tissue that is roughly the right shape and roughly the right place in the body to be lungs. One of the most famous examples of this is a placoderm called Bothriolipus, which has a single specimen with a pair of soft tissues that have been argued about quite a bit as to are they lungs or are they something else. The reason this is important will come up shortly. So remember the placoderm with maybe lungs. In addition, there are also some examples of invertebrate lung structures preserved in the fossil record. I found two that stood out to me. One is a 2008 study on an early Devonian arachnid called Paleocarinus, which preserves book lungs.
Yay.
Very similar structure to modern, spiders and scorpions that have those book lungs. And a study not too long ago in 2020 found fossils of a Eurypterid, Alophthalmus, one of the sea scorpions. This one's from the Carboniferous, which preserves book gills that have modifications that make them more like book lungs.
Ooh.
That they were adapted for aerial breathing.
That's so fun.
So the sort of pseudo book lungs in a way.
It's air book gills.
Air book gills. So there are that list is, as far as I know, all of the lungs that have ever been found, or at least the ones that came up in a semi-thorough search for it. Lungs in both true lungs in vertebrates and lung-like structures in invertebrates simply tend not to fossilize very well, so we have very little fossil evidence of them. There is one exception. There is one group of animals that does a really good job at preserving lungs. Do you have a guess? Will's thinking.
Because initially I thought it might be like amber stuff, but a group.
Yeah, a group of life where most fossil species are known from at least one specimen with preserved lungs.
I don't know.
Coelacanths.
Oh.
And the reason is that coelacanth lungs are surrounded by bony plates.
Yeah.
This is true in modern coelacanths, and it is true in fossil coelacanths. These bony plates, which have a name that I didn't write down, are probably there to help provide support for the lungs, but also, you were talking about earlier with whales, probably to help provide support against the water pressure from compressing those lung structures.
It's a lung bathysphere.
Yes. In modern coelacanths, like you said earlier, their lung is vestigial, which makes all the sense in the world because modern coelacanths are deep water fish.
Yes.
But they're like middle to deep water fish. Modern coelacanths are probably never encountering the surface of the water. They have no reason to need to breathe air. But calcified fossil lungs, same structure, same position as modern coelacanths, are known from fossils, but they are often larger with every sign of having been fully functional.
Yeah.
So coelacanths actually have a full fossil record of lungs, and it seems like similar to lungfish, lungs have been a common feature of coelacanths throughout their evolutionary history.
Which is so well, and it's so fun because, like, when you think of a lungfish, it kind of makes sense because a lot of those are known from like shallow water, freshwater pools,
right?
And like, you guys are right at the air, but coelacanths, even the ones that lived in the past and were probably not living as deep down, and even though they're weird fish, that's still a very fish-shaped fish. Like,
yes.
that you're obviously built for swimming. You don't have little noodly arms that you can move around with. You are a swimming animal, so the idea that you have fully functional lungs is crazy.
Yeah. Now, since there is not a lot of direct fossil evidence for lungs, there's a lot of research that will look for indirect evidence, signs. Now, obviously, if it's a land animal, the
Yep.
indirect evidence is that it is, if you find a fossil lizard, all right, lungs, because there is no reason to think that any lizard would not have lungs. But for fish and sometimes amphibians, it can be a little bit trickier. So there are other traits that paleontologists will look for to show evidence of air breathing in fossil fish. For example, sometimes we'll find fossil evidence of spiracles, which,
Mm-hmm.
like in insects, are openings in the skull that allow air to come in. Spiracles have been noted to be extra large in the fish closest related to tetrapods, which makes sense if they were breathing more air. And also, in some cases, spiracles on fossil fish are known to be larger in hypoxic conditions, in oxygen poor waters. The spiracles were larger, which suggests that they were better at supplementing their air supply by taking it in, their oxygen supply by taking it in from the air.
Yeah, that's the same conditions that you see a lot of your air gulping fish, like gars and stuff like that. They have gills, but they live in still water ponds that have very little oxygen in water, so they just gulp some air and use that. That makes a ton of sense.
Speaking of air gulping, you mentioned that a lot of the fish that breathe air are using that buccal pumping, taking the air into the mouth and then forcing it down into the lungs. That behavior has a few structures in the skull and in the mouth that tend to correlate with that we see in modern fish and amphibians. So sometimes we can find similar skull structures that suggest that ancient fish might have been using buccal pumping the same way.
Cool.
Similarly, sometimes we'll see rib structures, particularly in early tetrapods, like the earliest amphibious creatures. We'll see certain elongated ribs around the neck and the front of the body that match what we see in modern species that help to do the expanding and contracting and also protect the lung structures underneath.
Cool.
So there are a bunch of these corollary features that we can find in fossils. It can be tricky. I've seen this pointed out in a number of studies because a lot of these features can also have other functions. So sometimes it's hard to say whether this was for sure an air breathing adaptation, but we can at least find clues to help us figure out, yeah, this is a fish that probably had lungs because it looks like it was adapted for breathing air.
Which is a neat concept. So often when we have super soft bodied parts, especially things inside the body, where it's not like the eyes, which has a nice pocket in the skull. Like most of our internal organs are kind of just not floating around, but just in our big body bag. Like
they're just packed in there like a suitcase.
Yes. So it is really cool to realize there actually are notable scaffolding that has to go into place for you to have lungs in some cases.
Yes.
Cool.
Now, the fossil evidence, especially those indirect bits of evidence, plus modern phylogenetic and genetic studies together help us put together the story of when lungs first showed up. So vertebrate lungs in particular have been the focus of tons of research looking into when did lungs first evolve and what did they look like. From the evidence that we have, lungs appear to be an ancestral feature of bony fish.
Yes.
So osteichthyes, which includes the ray-finned fish, which is most of your fish, and lobe-finned fish, which are coelacanths and lungfish and stuff, all across our modern diversity, all bony fish seem to have the capacity for lungs, if not lungs themselves. Cartilaginous fish, which are your sharks and rays and chimeras, don't have lungs. So sharks don't have lungs. It's been noted that they do have some of the genetic components for creating lungs, for building lungs, but they don't have all of the components that actually allow the lungs to form and be functional lungs. So some of the ingredients are in there, but it seems like true lungs probably evolved after the cartilaginous and bony fish split from each other on the bony fish lineage. Now, earlier I pointed out that there is that one fossil of the Placoderm Bothriolipus that has been suggested to have lungs. And if that's true, that changes the thing that I just said. Because
Yes.
placoderms are outside of that group. And that would suggest that lungs might have evolved earlier. But that specimen is not everyone agrees that those are actually lungs. There are other interpretations. It's been argued back and forth a bit.
Very cool. It's also not something that I don't think I expected it to go back to the origin of bony fish. Like I expected it to be our cousins, the lobe-finned fish, but bony fish is further back than I expected.
And it's going to get even more fun.
E.
So there is evidence of air breathing in fish back to at least the Devonian. I've also seen at least one paper that suggested air breathing evolved in the Silurian. So at least 350 to 400 million years ago, we see evidence of fish breathing air. It has been pointed out that one of the defining features of the Devonian period, especially toward the end of the Devonian, was low oxygen levels in the oceans.
Yeah.
In fact, that's one of the leading factors of the late Devonian mass extinctions, is dropping oxygen levels. So it has been suggested that the ability to breathe air might have been important for fish to survive certain habitats in the Devonian period.
That makes sense.
It's also pointed out that evidence of air breathing in fish has been noted in fossils from both marine and freshwater habitats, which makes it difficult to figure out where it first occurred. Right?
Yeah.
Probably it first showed up in some habitat, but the fossil record has not given us the appropriate clues to figure that one out yet.
Interesting.
Lungs are not a ton is known about like physically where lungs originated. There's been a lot of study into embryology and how lungs develop during the development of an animal. They seem to have probably emerged as a pouch off of the throat or the foregut, like the front part of the digestive system, probably similar to a lot of other organs. It has been suggested that lungs likely originated as a singular organ, not as a pair of organs. And this is supported partially by the fact that, as you were pointing out, lots of fish have single lungs.
Yes.
And lots of fish also have unpaired lungs, where the lungs they might have two lungs, but they don't function the same way, or they'll have like a different passage that feeds into them. Based on this and based on embryology, it's been suggested that the original lungs might have been a single midline organ, and that true paired lungs might be a tetrapod thing. That might be something that happened with animals that moved up onto land. Because having paired lungs makes it that much more efficient, allows you to take up that much more air, allows you to have redundancy, and is good for not only breathing air on land, but fueling the kind of high metabolism that early animals moving onto land needed to be able to do.
Yeah. It also makes sense that it would be a fairly simple step to start with one organ and duplicate it. Like,
yes,
that is not biologically that tricky of a thing to do.
Now, it is impossible, I think, to talk about the origin of lungs without also talking about swim bladders.
Yes.
As we pointed out earlier, swim bladders are gas-filled chambers that are found in ray-finned fish. So the ray-finned corner of the bony fish, they have swim bladders. Swim bladders and lungs are extremely similar to each other. Not only are they balloons that take in and release gas, they develop very similarly. Their structure is similar. Their histology is the structure of the tissue itself is very similar. The proteins that they create and utilize are very similar. They're also both used for the same things. Like swim bladders are mostly used for buoyancy and lungs are mostly used for respiration. But there are examples of both being used the other way. Swim
Yes.
bladders for respiration and lungs, like you pointed out, with crocodiles and lungfish being used to help with buoyancy. So, all in all, swim bladders and lungs are strong, generally considered to be very closely related structures. But based on the evidence that we have, it seems to be thought to be most likely that lungs are ancestral to bony fish and swim bladders in ray-finned fish are a modified lung.
Huh. That is the opposite of what I would have bet if you had asked me to make a bet.
Same.
Yep.
Because it feels very intuitive that, yes, fish evolved swim bladders, which is a thing that fish need, and then lungs came from that as fish moved out onto land. But it seems that lungs go back quite a bit, and swim bladders are a thing that happened in one particular group of fish, which just happens to be most of the fish now, which was a modification of the lung structure.
Yeah, because I was waiting to make a point when you're like, yeah, cartilaginous fish seem to have some of the ingredients for lungs, but just none of the structure and have never developed lungs. And my brain was like, well, yeah, of course not. They don't have swim bladders. What would they develop it from? And
Yes.
turns out that wouldn't have mattered. You would have needed a lung first to be able to have a swim bladder.
Yeah, cartilaginous fish have neither.
That's that. I mean, it does make sense because like air breathing fish seems like a very alien thing, but we've gone over multiple situations in the fact that it actually is very useful to be able to breathe air as a fish. If you're in poor quality water, if you are in shallow water, it is very helpful to be able to just be able to go up to that huge supply of free oxygen hovering above your water and just gulp some of it in. So it totally makes sense that that would be a very strong driver. And then once you have this balloon in your body, to go, oh, wow, this really changes the way I'm able to float around. If I mess with that, that could be really useful.
Yeah, it's very intuitive to think of air breathing as being something that fish only needed during the transition into fully terrestrial animals. But much like we've talked about with the strong fins, there's a lot of benefits to having bony fins, lobe fins, to help scoot yourself around that don't have anything to do with evolving to be fully terrestrial. Same thing with lungs. There's a lot of benefits to being able to breathe air as a fish, completely divorced from transitioning into a land dwelling animal. So it makes sense that these are features that showed up early. Fish experimented with them in a bunch of different ways. And one of those ways was allowing them to scooch out onto land.
Yeah. Well, and it feels very similar to what we talk about with feathers, that it's so easy to want to say, so why did you have these flying devices before you could fly? Well, they weren't flying devices. It is so easy to look at the world now where most fish are ray-finned fish with a gas bladder, and very rarely are there ones with a lung or a breathing gas bladder. So it's very easy to look at that and go, well, obviously, those are the ones who made a weird gas bladder and it turned into a lung. But the past was not like things are today. This current setting is not how it started. So yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, but I'm still I don't know if I'm fully comfortable with it yet. That's weird.
Now, on the invertebrates side of things, there is very little to go on from the fossil record. So, again, there's been lots of phylogenetic discussion. Invertebrates are extremely complicated because, as we discussed before, lungs or lung like structures are known in a bunch of different invertebrates across crustaceans, arachnids, insects with their tracheal tubes, snails, and most of these didn't come onto land at the same time.
Yes.
So, adaptations for air breathing is something that has happened over and over and over again in invertebrates. In crustaceans, there's tons of variety. You mentioned some of them have like gills inside of a lung chamber. Others have simple air pockets. Terrestrial isopods have specialized internal chambers that function like lungs, which may have come about more than one time.
Yeah.
Some also have tracheal systems, like insects do. So crustaceans have just evolved a whole bunch of different solutions to this. In contrast, arachnids are hypothesized to have had a single origin of book lungs.
Yes.
That evolved once. It developed from book gills, which is supported by that one sea scorpion that I mentioned that has book gills adapted slightly for air breathing that makes them slightly more like book lungs. The adaptation, an important part of the adaptation is the space for the air chambers in between the folds. And I think that if I remember right, that sea scorpion had like pillars that help to hold the folds apart from each other to make space for those air chambers.
Oh, that's awesome.
Another fun note about arachnid air breathing is that book lungs appear to have only originated once. They tend to be paired, like you mentioned before, in several different lineages of spiders and arachnids generally. One of the book lung in the pair have been modified into a tracheal system.
Yeah.
Like insects. So some spiders have a book lung and a tracheal system.
Yeah. Which is it, as is so often the case with arthropods, they can play around with parts of their anatomy in ways that us vertebrates just can't do.
Yes. And then gastropods, you mentioned a lot of snails and slugs have that their version of a lung, that cavity in the mantle. Some of them also have an insect-like tracheal system. According to one paper that I read, aerial respiration is thought to have evolved in gastropods at least 10 times. Just in gastropods. So invertebrate, lungs and lung-like structures seems to be a thing that they have just done dozens of times.
I got a picture of two different species of sea snail, and one is like, I'm gonna go head up land. You want to come? I was like, I'll do it later.
Yeah. No, I don't think that your way's gonna work. I have my own ideas.
I'm working on something. That's it. It makes total sense because things coming out of the water is something that aquatic life has been doing for a very long time. So it makes sense that every time it happens, you potentially are going to have a new form of breathing system. But for it to be seemingly that easy to happen feels very weird as a member of a group who shares general lung structure with the vast majority of other large land animals.
It really makes it seem like we didn't try very hard.
Yeah.
Like vertebrates did it once and we were like, nailed it. And meanwhile, invertebrates were like, I got a new design. Let's try this one.
It's the quote from, I think it was George Carlin, that said when he does stand-up special, he throws away all the jokes from the last special and writes an entirely new thing. And I only know that because it was being talked about by some more recent comedian who was like, that's terrifying. What?
Yeah, arthropods and other invertebrates are just trying. And I assume worms are just breathing through their skin like salamanders
I know
do.
They also have like spherical openings for some of them. I know they also have breathing holes, but I think it is also just like, and then that goes into the body and then connects to your, circulatory system. Because because insects also get to have their blood flow just be, you just have blood in your body.
Yeah, a lot of insects have what they call an open circulatory system. They being not the insects, but people who study them, where it is, there's just like a sprinkler system in there that just spreads the hemolymph all over the body cavity.
And so it would make sense that for inverts, it is probably a less daunting task to develop air breathing because you only need one breath for us would set you good for days.
Yes.
And so, like,
enough,
you need
enough energy to power a whole hive.
Or something really big for a minute. But so, like, it makes sense that, like, you need very little air compared to us high energy large animals. So some tubes in your body is enough to get started, and you can just kind of, like, if you come out with wet gills still, you can do well for a little bit out of water. So it's easy for you to then start to mess with those wet gills and get them to be even better. So it makes sense. It's just for us who have these super specialized lungs, it's a very weird idea to just be like, yeah, just do it again.
We're going for quality over quantity. Speaking of super specialized lungs, when we talk about lungs in the fossil record, almost every time we are either talking about fish and the evolution of lungs or birds.
Yep.
Because birds have that air sac system, which is distinctive and unique to birds, but evolved in their ancestors. And there has been tons of research on, can we figure out which dinosaurs had a similar breathing system?
Yeah.
So as we sort of started talking about earlier, birds have lungs. They're made of a very similar respiratory tissue as ours. They also form a lot of air sacs, which are these outpouchings. They are called diverticula, which just means we have diverticula in some of our organs, which is just if an extra pouch forms of some tissue. This can happen in an evolutionary sense. It can also be pathological. Diverticulitis is a thing. When I looked up diverticula, that was the first thing that came up. It was like WebMD, diverticulitis. And I was like, not that.
Yeah, unwanted pockets.
So it's just all these extra pockets of respiratory system that form these extra chambers that allow birds to have this complex and efficient breathing system. Many of their air sacs actually invade bones.
Yes.
So birds have these open hollow spaces in a lot of their bones, and in many of them, these air sacs form in that chamber. This is not unique to birds. Our sinuses are basically the same thing. Right? Our sinuses are these holes that are connected to our nasal passage, and it's a hole in your skull that is fully filled in with this balloon of tissue that allows air to circulate in there. Birds have it in their vertebrae and their ribs and their hips. Bird air sacs come in there's two different sections of the air sac system. The cervical air sacs, which enter into the neck vertebrae and the front vertebrae of the body, of the torso. And the abdominal air sacs, which form later in the development of birds, invade the farther back trunk vertebrae and the hip bones.
Cool.
So all the way to the hips, birds have air sacs sticking out into their bone cavities. Air sacs are extremely thin. I saw them described as a few cell layers thick. The wall of an air sac is a few cells. Wow. And not all air sacs invade bones. So there is very little fossil remnant of the air sacs themselves. But when they interact with bones, we can find evidence of an air sac system in the fossilized bones themselves. Generally speaking, this comes in two forms. One, if we're really lucky, just the holes in the bone where the air sacs used to sit. These are called pneumocoels. This is like our sinus cavities, right? If you can find these distinctive cavities in the bone, that's where the air sacs were. Sometimes there's a dent in the bone, a fossa, as opposed to an enclosed chamber, and these will have a little entrance.
Yes.
So you'll have a chamber in the bone that isn't completely closed. There will be a little entrance into that chamber, like our sinuses have a little entrance into the main nasal chamber. Also, there are specific bone structures that are found within those cavities that support the structure of the cavity. There's also been some research that has identified that the bone tissue, the histology of bone is different when it's adjacent to these air sacs.
Okay.
So there are ways to look at a cavity in a bone and identify it as a bone that once held an air sac as part of the respiratory system.
Very neat.
This allows us to determine which ancient relatives of birds had air sacs. Evidence of air sacs has been found in theropod dinosaurs, which makes all the sense in the world. That's the group that birds belong to.
Yep.
Sauropod dinosaurs, which are the long neck, long tail ones, and pterosaurs,
Yes.
which are not dinosaurs, but closely related, the flying reptiles of the Mesozoic. This evidence in at least two of those groups goes back to the late Triassic. So this evolved early on, but it has been noted that air sacs appear to be absent in the earliest dinosaurs,
Interesting.
which suggests that pterosaurs, sauropods, and theropods probably evolved air sacs separately from each other. Or at the very least, they evolved air sacs that invade the bones separately from each other. It's possible that some form of air sacs was present in their shared ancestors, but the earliest dinosaurs don't have these air sac filled cavities. And if they don't have them, then their ancestors shouldn't have had them. And those were the ancestors of pterosaurs and sauropods and theropods split very early. So this seems to, that pneumatic skeleton with the spaces for the air sacs, seems to have evolved at least 3 separate times.
That is very intriguing. I was wondering because I know that the circular breathing, the unidirectional breathing, is often thought to be ancestral to archosaurs, since both birds and crocs have it.
Mm-hmm.
I know that the research that found it in monitor lizards was like, if this is the same, then it pushes it way further back. But most likely lizards did it on their own. But that's the unidirectional breathing is probably ancestral to archosaurs in general. So it's interesting that it seems like that part of that system developed potentially separately multiple times.
Yeah.
Huh.
Generally, these seem to be a very similar structure to what we see in birds. In pterosaurs, they have these pneumatic spaces, these air cavities in the bones, similar to birds in the vertebrae and like neck ribs and stuff like that, but only in the front part of the body, similar to the
Okay.
cervical air sacs of birds. So it's possible that pterosaurs only had that front set of air sacs, whereas sauropods, the earlier sauropod groups, have just the front parts of the body with those cavities, but then later groups have additional air sac cavities in the hips and tailbones, which is a thing that birds don't get because birds don't have tails. But in sauropods, they were like, we're going to use every bone that we possibly can.
That's so many.
So in sauropods, it seems like they might have, early on, they evolved anterior air sac systems, and then later on they evolved the posterior air sac system, which is the same order that it happens in the development of modern birds.
Yes.
That as embryos, while they're developing, the front air sacs show up first, and then the back air sacs. So it might have followed a similar pattern in dinosaur evolution.
Very cool.
Apparently air sacs all the way back to the hips and tails evolved separately in both diplodocids and titanosaurs, which notably are 2 sauropod groups that include the absolute largest land animals that ever lived.
Yes.
Which brings us to the function of these air sacs, because so often, right, as with everything with birds, we are so inclined to point at a thing that birds have and go, well, obviously that must be to help them fly.
Mm-hmm.
And much of the time, it does help them fly, but that's not necessarily the original purpose that it evolved for, or that it served when it first evolved. Air sacs certainly help to improve respiration. They help make that very efficient breathing system that birds have. They're also used in thermoregulation because you've got these gas exchange surfaces that can help regulate temperature. Those are features that would be very useful in any active group of animals. but also dinosaurs grew really fast, and so did pterosaurs. So the air sag system might have helped to fuel a rapidly growing body. Also, having those air spaces in the skeleton keeps the weight of the skeleton down, which would be
Yes.
helpful in pterosaurs for getting off the ground and helpful in sauropods for not collapsing under their own enormous weight. It is notable that theropods, sauropods, and pterosaurs all grew to unexpectedly gigantic sizes,
Yes.
which might have been helped by the fact that A, their skeletons weren't as heavy as they otherwise would have been because they had these air spaces in them, and that efficient respiration might have allowed them to fuel bigger and bigger bodies.
Yeah.
I even saw one paper that hypothesized that with all of these air spaces throughout the bones, it might have also allowed for skeletal body mass to be redistributed. That if the skeleton is lighter overall or in certain places, you can get away with concentrating more skeletal mass in certain areas. And they were specifically hypothesizing that this might have been what allowed pterosaurs to develop those big head crests.
Oh, yeah.
That because the skeletons were kept relatively lightweight and because they had all this space in it, that they had the leeway to build these big elaborate skeletal structures. This is a hypothesis I saw mentioned in one paper. So there isn't like
Yes.
it doesn't seem like there is a solid basis for this necessarily, but it is a very interesting idea that this structure of the skeleton frees you up to do other different things.
Well, I was having the same thought about theropods, and this is purely just off the top of my own dome. This I have no clue if there's anything for this, but like as a kid and even at times as an adult, I have moments looking at a theropod and questioning of like how is that tail balancing your torso and like the leg muscles and the attack are doing a big job to hold things up, but there's some dinosaurs you'll look at and it's like, how in the world are you not falling forward? You've got so much torso or head in some cases for the big predators up front that it just doesn't seem like it should balance. But if your front of your body has a bunch of air chambers in it, maybe the weight displacement was different.
Yeah, that's also, it's been pointed out, especially if you look at like T-Rex.
Mm-hmm.
T-Rex's skull is full of giant holes.
Yes, it is.
And those are in part to, that's where the eyes go and other, muscle attachments. But it also means that T-Rex's colossal noggin weighed a lot less than it otherwise would if it was solid bone.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, like and I'm sure this is the case for many small theropods, but like if you pick up a chicken, you always have that sensation of like, is that really all you weigh? I'm sure if you picked up a little dromaeosaur, it would feel the same way of like, why do you feel like a boat? You're so light. It's like, yeah, because you're full of air chambers and stuff. You just don't weigh as much as you look like you should weigh.
So lungs and their core associated structures get a ton of focus in paleontological and evolutionary studies, despite very little actual fossil evidence. We got it in fish, we've got it in dinosaurs, and thankfully, archosaurs were kind enough to evolve a system where they put some of their lungs inside of their bones, which was very considerate of them. And coelacanths did us the honor of surrounding their lungs with bones, which also was very nice of them. Outside of that, there's very little to go on.
Yeah, one and it makes sense that even though we don't see it often, it gets focused on so much because it is fundamental to being a land animal. Like unless you're a salamander, you need you need lungs to be up here on dry land, and it is a critical aspect of being a land vertebrate, and they are vastly diverse in the ways different groups are utilizing them and their functioning. So it's a question you kind of can't avoid after a bit of just like, okay, but how were your lungs working? Because to be the kind of animal you seem to be, it feels like there are certain lungs you'd need to have. Is that accurate, or does that make sense? Cool. Well, hope you all enjoyed our discussion of lungs. We're going to wrap up, since we talked about basically all the fossil examples and went through the general structures of lungs. This is one of those rare examples where I feel like we did a pretty good job covering.
This is pretty good. This is a pretty good overview.
Yeah,
There's certainly more nuance. There's a lot more.
Exactly.
I'm sure there's plenty of people out there who have worked on like early fish who would be able to say, well, there's so much more to what we know about early lung evolution. And I came across more details, but they were very technical details that I decided to leave out in favor of getting to talk about air sacs and stuff.
And I'm sure there's like other fun examples among animals that just I did not stumble across, where they're like, oh, you didn't talk about sheep lungs. They do this weird thing.
There's probably a ton of invertebrate stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Wait, I think that I listed all of the vertebrate fossil lungs that have been discovered. I picked the first couple of invertebrate examples that I found. There's probably more out there.
Yeah. But yeah, lungs. Cool body part. I'm grateful to it. So I'm glad I know more about it now. Before we wrap up the episode, we have one last section, which is our patron question. Every episode, we like to answer a question from one of our patrons, which you can submit to us if you are subscribed at a certain level. Today, we have 2 questions. What's our first question?
First question comes from Kitsune. Very appropriate question. Asks, which came first, the swim bladder or the lungs? Well, as we discussed just 20 minutes ago, apparently lungs.
Apparently.
Like some form, like an early form of lung, seems to have then given rise to swim bladders as we know them.
Yeah. I also, and I didn't go into it because we hadn't gotten to the evolution section yet, but the part talking about the fact that coelacanth and lungfish lungs are positioned up and go around the esophagus does suggest and imply that they started below it. Mm-hmm. And so they also might have started roughly where they are in us and then moved up and then I guess moved back in our ancestors or something. I don't know. So fish lungs are
bouncing
weird.
Around.
Yeah, weird.
Our second question comes from James, who asks, what has been the most impressive museum display you have seen, and why did it catch your attention so much?
Very fun question. I picked this because I have an answer that applies very fittingly to this episode. Probably the most impressive and awe-inspiring museum exhibit I've ever been to is Bodies the Exhibition. It came here to Johnson City once back when I was in grad school, and this is an exhibit of actual preserved human bodies that have been dissected in a extremely variable number of ways to show different aspects of human anatomy. So people without skin to show all the muscle, people where it's only the circulatory system.
Yep.
It's just all the veins in the heart, and then people cut in half down the middle from front to back, a person who's been sliced so that you can see the cross section from head to toe. Just a myriad of different ways to see inside the human body and really get an appreciation for what we look like inside. And a lot of them are also, the bodies are positioned and posed to show the body in different motions, running, jumping, dancing. Mm-hmm. And so you're not just getting to see the musculature or the internal organs, but you get to see what position your guts are in when you're jumping. And so it's just this really humbling look at the inside of us. And I was blown away.
Yeah, I saw the Bodies exhibit when it was in Times Square, and you walk into the room and it's just full of bodies in these colorful displays. It's really captivating. It's such a immersive way to introduce those concepts of anatomy. The exhibit that I saw, right in the center of the hall, they had a human skeleton riding a horse skeleton. So
Yes,
you could
yes.
see like the musculature and the bone structure of the horse compared to the person that was on top of it, which was very cool.
And it made me appreciate myself way more.
Yeah. The first museum display that comes to mind when I read James's question is when I was an undergraduate, I visited the Denver Museum of Nature and Science in Colorado, and they had, I think, recently unveiled their exhibit, which was, I believe, was called Prehistoric Journey. And it was this hall that they had filled with interior walls that subdivided the room. And on these walls were these giant murals depicting scenes from Denver at different points in time.
Yeah.
So it was like, it'd be like a scene from a forest and then a scene from the surface of the interior seaway. And they were so big in this enclosed space that you could stand in front of them and it was really immersive. And you could just step between these ecosystems throughout the history of this spot that you're standing on. And it was so cool. They were also, I have the book that went along with the exhibit that has the murals in it and descriptions and stuff. That's I think the first time I ever went into a museum exhibit and was, as an adult, was really struck with the impression that it left with me.
Cool. Oh.
Yeah. Also, a little while ago, I was at the Royal BC Museum in Victoria in Canada, and the Sioux exhibit was there. And you walk into this room, and was just a life-sized, fleshed-out model of Sioux. And that was, as much as we give, T-Rex gets all sorts of attention and all sorts of... Walking into a room with a T-Rex standing in it is a real experience.
That does kind of feel like the definition of impressive.
Yeah. Actually, I had the same thing just recently on Discord. The conversation popped up about Titanosaur displays.
Yeah.
And the first time I went to see the Titanosaur at the American Museum in New York City, that just standing in a room that dinosaur does not fit in. Mm-hmm. It sticks out of the room. There is something it's that like it's almost like vertigo. That sense of a thing that is too much and it is too big and it's overwhelming.
I had that same feeling when they added the display for Giganotosaurus and Argentinosaurus to Fernbank, because I had been going to that museum before they were in there, and then getting to walk into a space I've walked through many times and now see it mostly taken up by two dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Was that same feeling of like, nuh-uh. That, like, I had a moment of like, but that's not actually right, because I'm standing next to the leg and that leg bone's as big as me.
Yeah,
and
I'm eye to eye with
bone.
The knee.
Yeah, that's just one bone of this animal. So like, not for real though, right? It's just, it impresses upon you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for those questions. Those are two great questions.
Absolutely. And with that, we can start wrapping up. If you are interested in learning more about lungs, check out the blog. There'll be links, there'll be pictures. If there's anything we didn't mention, let us know. Or if there's a favorite lung example, if you have another cool lung factoid, because I'm sure there's dozens out there that are neat stuff about lungs, please share them. We have a Discord where I'm sure people would love to share lung facts. Remember that Leave It to Us is now out. It is its own podcast. It is out in the wild.
There should be 3 episodes. The first 3 episodes should be out by the time this episode is released. Leave It to Us has a section on the Discord. Leave It to Us you can follow on Instagram and Blue Sky. And there is a Leave It to Us Patreon that you can join for bonus content and interactions with the hosts and cool stuff.
Yeah. Stay tuned for next month where we will be in Croc Month. And as always, thank you to our requesters. Thank you to all of our new patrons. And tippy top thanks to our top tier patrons, Sarah May, Jeff Ellington, and Danielle the Bug Lover. And that's it. I have used up all of the air in my lungs to talk about lungs.
You're out of breath.
I am out of breath. I'm done.
We release episodes every fortnight. well, I was going to say don't hold your breath, but no, there will be an episode in 2 weeks after this one, because that's the
So hold your
pattern.
breath if you can.
Don't do that. We are not medical professionals. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as medical advice.
As a non-medical professional, I issue a challenge to
Just a deep inhale.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.